So in this advanced driving video, we're going to be looking really at things inside the car and the driver themselves, the techniques that we need, being able to use our mirrors, our horn, our lights, and things that we would directly control. So this also includes our braking, how we steer the car, and also how we use the power band and the throttle control, which are all important ingredients to becoming a good driver. So flashing your lights and sounding your horn are essentially the same thing. They warn other drivers to your presence, and they shouldn't really be used for anything else, certainly not in the UK. The UK Highway Code states that these devices are merely for warning your presence to other users. The horn has traditionally become a method used to tell other drivers they've just been an idiot. The lights are used to tell other drivers that they may proceed or go ahead. In a way, with the flashing of the lights, you're still saying I'm here and getting them to observe you, and you'll be in a parked position, and no doubt you'll be waving them on or directing them visually some way by gesturing through the windscreen when you've caught the driver's eye. Technically, the horn and the lights are just to warn other drivers of your presence, and people don't really use their horn. The horn can actually save you from a really nasty collision. If you're passing a junction and that driver hasn't observed you, the sounding of your horn can just minimize the risk of them pulling out blindly into your path. And you can also use your horn to warn other motorists. If they're about to blunder into a situation and you sound your horn, it may alert them and other drivers to any potential dangers or pitfalls ahead. So also within the car, you've got loads of other controls that are used infrequently. So the significant ones really are the lights. Do you know which lights are on at any given time? Do you know how to operate your fog lights? Do you understand that fog lights should only be used when it's foggy? They're not there for rainy conditions and they will just dazzle other drivers. Are we good at estimating our speed? That's another mark really of a good driver. A good driver can maintain a constant speed. I think most of us, it's fair to say, we drift off a little bit in our concentration when we're driving. So if you're maintaining a constant 70 or constant 50, sometimes that may drift up or drift down a little, so we're sort of averaging the 70 or the 50, and a good driver will keep it fairly consistent without resorting to continually checking the speedometer on the car. A good driver will know instinctively what speed they're traveling at without having to resort to keep checking the instruments on the car. So when you look in the mirror, you should reflect. That may sound like a really bad dad joke, but actually at a deeper level, we should be reflecting on what we see in the mirrors, thinking about it, responding to the information that's coming into our eyes. So when we're on the road and we're moving lanes, you learn mirror, signal, maneuver. Why are you signaling? Why are you using your mirror before you signal? And when should you be looking in your mirror throughout the maneuver? You need really to build up that picture of what's behind, ahead, and to the side of you as a driver. So should you need to take evasive action, you can do so clearly without having to check, because you've built up a clear picture of whatever is around you. So we could talk about a focus bubble around the car. So you want to keep your attention focused in front of you, not just on the car in front or the car in front of them, but way up in the distance. And it's not just looking at the road ahead, keeping that focus bubble ahead. We need to be using our mirrors and be aware of what's going on behind us. So you should have built up a picture of what's behind you so you don't have to look in your mirror to answer that question. So when cars join the road behind you or when they turn off, you should be aware of that and what's going on behind you as much as you would the cars in front of you. There's also little opportunities you get of using your mirrors that disappear over time. So for example, on a right-hand bend, looking in the left-hand mirror is pointless because that's going to be off to the distance. You're not going to see a thing, but your inside mirror has a wider vista of the road behind because you're going around that right-hand bend. So a good driver knows when to use the mirrors. It's not just a matter of timing, say every 6 or 7 seconds, you look in a different mirror. That would just be a drill. You need to be using the mirrors intelligently, and you need to be building up a picture of the drivers behind you. Are they impatient? Do they look like they're in control of their car? Are they following you too closely? So as you follow a driver or you've got a driver behind, you start to build up a picture of what they're like. So if they're being overly cautious or they keep slowing up as they come to a junction, that might indicate that they're planning to turn off, or they're a tourist and they're lost. They don't know the area very well. It may be they're in the middle of the road indicating left. So if that happened to me, I would assume that they could probably turn right. The position on the road would indicate they're about to make a right turn, whereas the indicators or the turn signals on their car are indicating something different. So never assume that the turn signal or the indications from another car are an actual real intention as to what they're doing. Most of the instruction that we get when we learn to drive the car is to press the brake pedal, which is the one next to the accelerator, and the harder we press it, the quicker the car will stop. And in an emergency situation, you need to press it very hard indeed. Well, they never really take the time to explain the physics involved, how you can graduate your braking and get the best braking advantage possible when it comes to stopping your car. Most cars' brakes will work more effectively when they're warm. If the brakes are cold, they're not at their maximum biting point. Now, when you actually brake in a car, you'll notice all of the weight is being thrown forwards, and you can use that to your advantage. So most drivers will be thinking having all the weight on the front of the car will just cause the car to skid. Well, it does at a certain point, but up to that point where you lose grip, you've actually maximized the grip potential of the car. So all the weight is being thrown forward. Those front wheels are really digging in. So braking is very much a function of grip, the amount of grip your tires have. When all the weight of the car is on those front tires, you're really increasing the grip. So when you're braking in an emergency situation, it's really good to get that braking momentum on as quickly as you can and as hard as you can. And then as you start reaching that point of adhesion, you start to lose that. At that point, you want to start backing off. Hesitating at that point can dramatically increase your stopping distance. Another thing drivers fail to do is to brake hard enough. So most drivers in an accident will generally brake. They tend to brake quite late because they've not drilled themselves to covering the brake pedal early. And you really do want to get the car under heavy braking momentum as quickly as possible in those emergency situations. And just as a little experiment, when you're out driving, make sure there's nothing behind you and use your left foot to brake. So your left foot has not become as accustomed to the fine-tuned graduated control that you've developed in your right foot. So you will generally brake much harder using your left foot. And just notice how much quicker your car will actually stop. So in an emergency situation, you need to stop as quickly as that. So interestingly, with braking, it's not a linear progression in terms of the car slowing up. So as you first press the brake pedal, from the higher speeds, you're peeling off speed relatively slowly, and the rate at which the car slows up accelerates as that speed drops. So you really want to get that process underway as soon as possible. You can shorten the overall braking distance by getting the car under braking momentum earlier rather than later. You may actually observe the road ahead, there'll be a hazard you've suddenly come onto, and it may be a case that by swerving to the right, you can extend the amount of road that you've got to brake in. Whereas if you carried going in a straight line, you would hit whatever it was that was the obstacle. Obviously, as you're turning, the car's weight is on those outside wheels, so they're more likely to lock up, so the ABS is going to cut in. But generally speaking, you will have more distance to brake in by taking that curved line than going in a straight line. So this is where part of that strategizing that we've already mentioned comes into play. So a little tip when braking for comfort for your passengers: if you just brake and keep consistent pressure on the pedal, the car is going to jolt forward as it stops. If as the car starts to slow up, you ease off the brake, you'll get a much more gradual rolling stop and you won't get that same jarring sensation. So in everyday driving, sometimes you have to brake maybe a bit harder than you wanted to. But getting that braking momentum building up and then easing off will go a long way to reassuring your passengers that you're in full control of the car and keep the overall journey comfortable for them. So think now about your stopping distances. So most people learn that the stopping distance at a set speed is a set distance. But if you ask the person to drop a cone ahead at that distance, they probably can't do it. They've just learned an academic number. Do you actually have a clear idea on how many feet or meters your car will take to stop at any set speed? Bear in mind, if two cars are coming towards each other, you need to double the stopping distance. They're both traveling at speed. So if they both start braking at the same point, their stopping distance is effectively going to be beyond each other. So they're going to crash. So when you're on those narrow country lanes, which we get a lot of in the UK, and there really is only room for one car, you need to be traveling slow enough to allow that car coming towards you to stop in time so you can avoid that collision. See, a good driver is keeping out of the way of other motorists. Another skill that's important to learn is heel and toe braking. Now, in a lot of modern cars, it's quite hard to brake and use the accelerator. You may have to switch around and use your toe and your heel. But the idea really is that you're braking, the clutch will often be down, you can just blip the throttle, rev match, or you can get the engine going, get the RPMs up. So if you've got a turbo engine, for example, you want the turbo to start spooling up before you get back on the power. That can shave important seconds off your lap times. It's probably not a skill you need to learn for driving around in everyday road situations, but it's certainly a useful skill to use. You want to use all of your limbs and keep things as smooth as possible when you're driving. So the gear, the clutch, if you drive a stick or a manual transmission, it's an essential skill really to understand how the gear mechanism's working, how the clutch is working and engaging and disengaging, and really the importance of rev matching. But we're going to discuss the power band, what the power band actually is, and how you can determine your car's power band. And that little piece of knowledge, knowing where your power band is, will enable you to make better gear selections, particularly when you're looking to maximize your acceleration. So in its simplest terms, the power band is that point in the RPM range where the engine is most responsive. You get the best acceleration. There's not a precise number. You don't suddenly hit a power band in a car. You hit a graduated point at which you would regard that as the start of your power band. In some cars, it's fairly obvious. In other cars, the power builds up very, very slowly. So how do you spot your power band? You've got your dyno graph on you. Well, the dyno graph is made up of two graphs superimposed on each other in most cases. You've got the power, the BHP, and you've got the torque. The torque graph is relatively flat. It goes up a little bit at the start, it's relatively flat, and then it tails off. The BHP, or the power graph, tends to spike up, so you'll see it typically going up at about 45 degrees up to a peak, and then the power will tail off. So to determine your peak power band using those graphs, it would start at one point where you're producing peak power, peak horsepower, and it would end when you've produced peak torque. So those points between peak torque and peak horsepower, that really is your power band. That's where you want to keep the RPMs for the maximum acceleration. If you haven't had a dyno run done on your car, or your car is fairly standard, you can usually find some kind of dyno graph online. Just search for your specific engine and power output. Often when companies offer you tuning upgrades, they will provide a before and after power figure. So if your car is factory standard, the before power figure will typically be that baseline that you're at. Now you've identified your power band by looking at the dynos and understanding the specific nature of your engine. Where are those shift points? Why is the shift point so important? Well, you notice that when you change down a gear, the RPMs increase. When you go up a gear, the RPMs decrease. That is a factor of gearing. Now, rev matching is where you attempt to match the transmission speed, the road speed, and the engine speed. So by blipping the throttle slightly when you change down a gear, you're increasing the revs. When you change up a gear, the revs are going to need to be lower when that gear engages. So by allowing a little bit of time for the engine revs to settle, you can again match the chosen speed and RPM and gear without having that crunching effect, or without overworking the synchro system within your car. So it promotes long life of your transmission and your car if you do this. It promotes a long life of the clutch as well if you use it sympathetically and if you can rev match. But when you're driving at speed, it's fair to say you're closer to the limit of traction, the limits of adhesion to the road surface. Very slight changes in your speed or your velocity can throw off the balance of the car and cause you to lose control. If you can change gear as smoothly as possible, it minimizes the risk of losing traction at these conditions where you're driving close to the edge. But just remember, a good driver doesn't push things too far. He knows where the car limits are in all weather conditions and road surfaces, and always drives to a safe margin below that. So a couple of runs that I've just done here, we're looking at the typical day-to-day drive of going from 20 miles an hour to 50 miles an hour. And I'm going to do the first run in second gear, So it's quite sprightly. It doesn't take very long to get up to 50 miles an hour in second gear. Now, doing the same thing in third gear is interesting. My car is a turbo, so it does take a while for the turbocharger to spool up. And you can actually see a phenomenal delay as the engine starts to pick up power, and eventually the turbo cuts in, and then you get the power. Knowing where the car's power band is will really help you to determine those shift points. So you may want to hang on to the RPM slightly longer outside the upper end of the power band in some cases, so that when you've changed down a gear or you change up a gear, you are still in the power band. The changes you're expecting with the RPMs of the engine really still keep you within that power band. So a good driver really anticipates where the RPMs are going to be when you've changed gear. If you're coming up to an overtake maneuver, it may be prudent to drop into the higher gear slightly early, making sure that you're in the maximum part of your power band through that overtaking maneuver. Conversely, you may decide to keep a lower gear to allow you to be in that power band earlier and change gear part way through that overtaking maneuver. It depends very much on your engine and on the circumstances, the road speed, and how much road you've got left, how quickly you need to do this particular maneuver, and how safe it is. In wet conditions, you would probably have a different set of priorities when it comes to choosing a gear than you would when you've got maximum grip in the drive. So when it comes to steering, there's some important considerations. We all learn to push and pull the steering wheel through our hands. And a lot of drivers will still passionately say that the push-pull method is the best. And yet when you talk to motorsports drivers, F1 drivers, and those taking the car out on the track, they tend to keep their hands on the wheel as much as possible, effectively maintaining their grip at a fixed point on the steering wheel, usually quarter to quarter past positions. So what's correct? What's the best way of steering the car? What are the things that you should look out for? And how do you develop a safe technique yourself? But there's actually almost a science behind steering. I'm sure that this is going to prove to be quite a controversial video because a lot of drivers have got very definite opinions when it comes to steering. There's different advocates of the steering methods. We've got the palm steer methods, we've got the push-pull method, and we've got the keep your hands on the wheel all the time as much as possible, even crossing your hands as you do steering maneuvers. So we're going to discuss the merits of each of those. I'm not going to be as dogmatic to say that one is right and one is wrong, because they all have their place depending very much on the circumstances that you find yourself in. So the only downside to keeping your hands in a fixed position and crossing them over as you use the steering wheel around town is that your hands are not located near the indicators and the light controls, which can be a problem if you need to indicate and you're making a turn off, for example, which is typical on your UK roundabouts. So it's probably a more track focused technique than it is driving on the road, but it does have merits and some people do seem to prefer this. But generally, both hands on the wheel gives you the maximum amount of control and the less risk of losing control of your car. So one of the things that you really want to avoid is making sudden jerky movements. The whole key when steering a car is to keep it as fluid as possible and to just make sure that you've always got two hands on the wheel. So the push-pull method is very effective when you're parking, moving at low speeds, and also when you're driving at higher speeds. It allows that fine graduated control over the steering. But in a competition and motorsports environment, you really want to have full control of the car. You need to be making very, very precise steering adjustments, maybe going from full lock on the right to full lock on the left to maybe hold a drift or catch the car in a corner. With the motorsports approach to steering, you would keep two hands on the wheel most of the time. But if you're doing the push-pull as well, that can make things quite easy to make those graduated steering controls and steering input. So the big habit you want to avoid is palm steering, just using one hand on the wheel. It's very tempting to get into that habit. The problem with palm steering is if your front wheel catches something, there is no way on earth you're going to be able to wrestle the car instantly into full control. So when you're steering on a bend, some drivers like to keep the car going in a straight line as much as possible. So that requires extra movements at sort of apex points. So they will divide a bend, a sweeping bend, into a series of straight points. Now, why do they do that? Well, if they have to brake, a car will stop more effectively in a straight line. So assuming your car has ABS, which most of them do now, that ABS system is going to back off the braking as soon as you start to reach those limits of adhesion. So by keeping the car in straight paths, you can maximize that ability to stop. But the downside of doing that is at those correction points where you effectively steer harder, your risking going into a skid. That's the point where you're most likely to lose control of the car. Choosing fixed points to straighten out a bend is also a good way of learning to feel the balance of the car in the corners and to get a feel for that essential weight shift that you as a driver are going to be controlling to maximize your control of the car. So there is very much a degree of finesse in that. When you're on a track, steering through corners and apexes is completely different. You really want to be focusing on the maximum exit speed of the corner. And if there are multiple corners or multiple bends, they need to be connected in a very fluid fashion. But the key always in steering on the track and on the roads is to keep things smooth and fluid. It's those jerky movements that can push the car from a point where it has sufficient grip into a point where it's going to start to struggle to get grip and throw you into a skid. So get used to the feel of the car in the corner. When you're cornering, your car weighs a ton, ton and a half, 2 tons, 3 tons. Cars are getting heavier and heavier nowadays. So that's a lot of weight on those 4 points of contact. So as you turn right, the weight is going onto the left side of the car. If you turn left, the weight is going onto the right-hand side of the car. So when you're driving along, get a feel for the weight of the car and the handling. If you can try and balance that with a trailing throttle when you're going around a corner, it stops all the weight going onto that front wheel or onto the back wheel. So both outside wheels are loaded up equally when it comes to weight distribution. So you're less likely to skid, lose traction or lose control. So subscribe to the channel, boot the like button. That really does help us to get out there. Share this course with your friends. Thanks for watching. See you in this next video that I've lined up for you.